Hi quilters, welcome to the 25th video in our series of quilts and projects to use leftover 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. I had this pile of leftover strips from a recent project I made for the shop. I had quite a few full width of fabric pieces and then a bunch of little pieces that are leftover bits of other strips. All of these beautiful fabrics are from the Prism II collection by Jason Yenter for In the Beginning Fabrics. These beautiful strips needed to have their own project, and I'd been wanting to make this Quilt-As-You-Go Sophie Tote by June Taylor for a while now. The package contains a color picture of the finished project, a full set of directions, the pre-printed fusible batting, and the webbing to make the handle. The fabric requirements for the bag are 1/4 each yard of a feature fabric and an accent fabric, 10 2.5-inch by width of fabric strips, 1/4 yard for binding, and then 2/3 yard for a lining. I'm going to try to use up as many of these strips as I can, but I did find a focus fabric I can use for the top of the bag for that band that goes all the way across the top. I'm going to use the black strips that kind of don't match the other ones as part of the handle, and then I picked a light fabric for the lining. For the smaller leftover strips, I'm going to piece those end to end to make the binding for the top and to use for part of the handles. The first thing to do is to cut out all the pieces you need according to the pattern directions. We're cutting some of the strips for the main part of the bag, the accent piece for the top little band, and then the larger band from the focus fabric. The pattern directions have all the sizes you need for each of the pattern pieces, and they also encourage you to watch the video of the Quilt-As-You-Go technique on their YouTube channel for June Taylor. You can also visit their website, junetaylor.com. If you want to purchase the Sophie Tote instructions with the pre-printed batting, we'll leave a link in the description below for our website where you can find the product, and we'll also leave a link to the June Taylor YouTube channel. You also need to cut off the excess batting on the pre-printed fusible batting, and then on the straps you need to cut on the line so you have the exact size piece that you need. And because this is a Quilt-As-You-Go project, you also need to get your lining cut out to the size that it calls for. And I also pressed mine so that it would be nice and flat and there wouldn't be any creases in it. Once you have it pressed, you want to attach the wrong unprinted side of the batting to the wrong side of the backing. And I just used a basing spray to get these two pieces to be nice and flat together. Smooth the fabric from the center out to the edges and make sure it is nice and flat, no creases anywhere. And remember, this is a fusible batting, so you don't want to use your iron yet, or the batting will stick to your iron. You should be able to see the printed lines on the batting. Next, you're going to place your fabric pieces right side up on the batting and align the edges with the lines. The lines are placement lines, not sewing lines. So the first strip goes down right side up and the second strip goes down right side down so that they face each other. Pin them in place to keep everything together, and then we'll start sewing. We will be sewing through all of the layers, so through both of the fabrics, the batting, and the lining. I'm going to use a thread that matches my lining so that you won't be able to see it once the lines are sewn on the inside of the bag. I also recommend using a walking foot so that all the layers will feed through the machine at the same rate. The pattern calls for a scant 1/4 inch sewing seam, so figure out where that is on your walking foot so you can line up everything correctly. A scant 1/4 inch seam is about a thread width or two off from a full 1/4 inch seam. Now you're just going to sew through all the layers. I did do a back stitch at the beginning and at the end of each of these seams. I made sure to trim all the beginning and ending threads as I went along. Finger press the seam open, and then we'll keep adding strips onto this set, following the numbers until you're covering the whole piece of the batting. up into that outer line. After each strip, I would check and make sure I hadn't shifted the fabric on the back side and made sure everything was laying nice and smooth. When you flip over the piece that you've just added, the edge of the fabric should fall on the edge of the next placement line. Once the batting is covered by fabric, you may safely iron the seams flat. Just make sure you don't go off onto the fusible batting because it will stick to your iron. Keep adding strips until you have the batting covered up to those outer lines. Once you have that all covered, you want to press it, and then you're going to start adding lines in the other direction. You will first add a small accent strip and then the larger focus fabric strip. My prints were non-directional, so I could put them on any direction, but if you have a directional fabric, you'll want to pay attention to which way you're pinning it on. If you're enjoying our video, we hope you'll give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to get more videos in the future using leftover 2.5-inch strips of fabric. Let us know in the comments section below what kind of projects are your favorites to work on. We love getting feedback from you, and we read all of the comments. At the very end, when you have it pressed, I highly recommend sewing across the very top less than 1/4 inch so that you have that top piece stay in place. Then you'll want to trim off any excess batting all the way around. Now we can start putting the tote together. You want to fold it in half, right sides together, and then using a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch seam allowance, sew the sides together. If you use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you can finish the edges on that seam with a pinking shears. If you use a 1/4 inch seam, you can either use a zigzag stitch to finish that inner side edge, or you can use a serger and finish it with a serger, or you can do like I'm doing, and I'm just going to bind that inside edge. I have all these leftover strips. I thought I might as well use them and make the edges of the inside of the bag nice and pretty. And you just want to have raw edges at the top and the bottom. You don't have to fold them in or anything because those will get enclosed inside other seams. I'm folding my 2.5 inch strip in half, right sides out, so wrong sides together, and then I'm just sewing it using a 1/4 inch seam allowance onto the sides of the bag. Once I have the pieces sewn in and trimmed, I'm going to press and then flip them around to the other side to cover the seam and then top stitch them into place. Remember, this is going to be the inside of the bag, so it doesn't have to be perfect. If you want this binding to blend in to the inside, you could use the same fabric that you used for the lining, and then you wouldn't even see it at all. The next step is to box out the corner, and that means you're just going to flatten those bottoms and then sew that seam. Just make sure that the fabric on the inside isn't bunching up or getting creased. I just sewed a 1/4 inch seam at the very bottom, and I just wanted to sew these seams shut so they were enclosed. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the sides of the bag. I'm going to put a binding piece across the bottom to finish those edges off very nicely. If you didn't want to go to the trouble of putting a binding down there on that bottom section, you could also just serge those seams or do a zigzag stitch. Since this is going to be the bottom of the bag, I'm just going to fold over the binding piece at the start of the seam and at the end of the seam. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is just the inside of the bag. I did do some back stitching at both the start and the finish of the seam. Now that the inside of the bag is finished and looking nice, we're going to flip the whole thing right side out and work on the binding and the handles. My next job is to sew all my little sections that are leftover pieces from other projects into one long strip. I will use these pieces that are sewn end to end as the binding around the top of the bag, and I will also put the batting inside these pieces and cover it up for the strapping. I cut the strapping in half and folded the black strips around those pieces. I've also put the batting in the pieced sections and folded it around there and gotten that pressed. Everything lays nice and flat. Don't worry about the raw edges. The raw edges of both of these will get enclosed when you top stitch the webbing strips to the batting strips. The ends will still be raw edges, but those will get enclosed when you put the binding on. Sew the binding to the bag on the top edge on the inside of the bag. I'm using my leftover pieces for the binding just because I want to use up those leftover pieces, but I think the pattern calls for you to use the same fabric as your focus fabric. Once you have the binding put on, you want to make sure to give it a good press all the way around so you have a nice flat edge when you top stitch. But before you do the top stitching, you want to add the straps to the seam so you can match up all the raw edges and enclose those raw edges of the straps into the binding. So you want to position your strapping and make sure that you don't twist it. Make sure it makes kind of like a U shape, pin it into place, and then you want to baste those ends into the seam allowance. When you're basting them in, you want to make sure that you're not catching the binding in there, so make sure that's folded back. And then I usually go over the seam 2 or 3 times to make sure it's nice and sturdy. Once the straps are all sewn in, you want to remove any of the pins you've placed, and then you want to attach the binding. And I just top stitched it all the way around. I used a multicolored thread just to give it a little extra pizzazz. There are a lot of fun variegated threads available, so use something that matches your color palette. When going over the straps, I would go over them once, then backtrack, and then hit it again for like 3 lines of stitching. That way I knew that they were nice and stable and it's going to be very strong. The last step is to stitch a line of stitching about 1/2 inch or 1 inch away from the binding so that you have something to measure by, and then flip the strap up and top stitch very close to the edge. So you won't see all those lines of stitching. You'll only see that one final line of stitching along the very top. I was able to make this bag in a single evening. It went together very fast. Having the pre-printed batting is the key that makes this go so quickly. I love the scrappy straps with the black accent that goes on top, and I love the scrappy binding too. I think that just adds a nice little flourish. I'm also glad that I bound the inside seams. It finished it off really nicely. This was an excellent use of my leftover strips from another project. I haven't made a lot of headway lately on my strip bucket, but I'm only adding this many pieces in from this particular project, and then from other projects I just have a small pile to put into my bucket. I'm 25 projects into using up my leftover strips, and I still have a ways to go. If you like the video, make sure to give us a thumbs up, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!